Hi, one and all. Welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. This is Moshe Norman out of Lakewood, New Jersey, and it's good to see some new faces and some familiar faces. Good to see everybody. For those of you who can turn on your videos, we always like to see as many faces as we can. For those of you who'd like to ask questions or comments, please remember to use the reactions button and raise your hand on the bottom right of your screen. And of course, please do not provide any identifying information. Somebody on here is going to know whoever you're talking about if you're talking about a client. So no identifying information. It's good to see everybody back for another week. This week, we are privileged to have Dr. Paris Williams, who is an expert in psychosis, dissociation, right? And the author of the book, Rethinking Madness. His website is rethinkingmadness.com. For those of you who are curious and want to learn more about him and about madness. You know, my parents always told me that I was mad, but apparently there's more to it. Just FYI, Dr. Williams is in Dunedin. What is it? Where are we?
Yeah, Dunedin,
New Zealand. So I know that right now we are where I am in the tri-state area. It's Monday, 9:03 p.m. and it's winter. And where Paris is, it's Wednesday or Thursday.
Tuesday at 3
Tuesday. What's it? What time?
3 p.m.
3 p.m. and it's the dead of the summer. So, and by the way, Dr. Williams does have a number of extra bedrooms in his home for those who would like to take a vacation. His room in Dunedin, New Zealand. But Dr. Williams, your accent is giving you away. You're not from New Zealand.
Yeah, I've been working on my New Zealand accent, but it's just not.
Okay. So can you tell us who are you and how did you get into this field of psychology? Were you struck with psychosis? You know, tell us the story.
Yeah. Okay. So you can probably tell from my accent that I'm from the United States originally. I might have picked up a little Kiwi accent, but it's still pretty strong. Raised in California, Northern California, and spent a lot of time actually living in other parts of the U.S. I lived in Colorado, Utah, Florida, Georgia. Traveled around the world quite a bit in my younger years. So actually, my youngest years took me into a passion of hang gliding. So I actually got really into hang gliding and travel. I just loved traveling and meeting different people from different walks of life. And so I worked for hang gliding manufacturer, a couple different manufacturers doing competition and also a lot of teaching, instruction. And then I was getting actually increasingly into meditation, so mindfulness meditation particularly, and kind of drawn a bit into the Buddhist philosophy and when in my 20s. And then,
by the way, the only thing more exciting than hand gliding is mindfulness and psychology.
That's right. That's right. There's actually a lot in common. When you're hang gliding, you need to be very mindful, or you can die pretty easily. So I already had a bit of presence is very important. But I guess putting my sort of story in a nutshell, I had a lot of my own childhood trauma, so pretty tough stuff. I ended up living in a corrective foster home for a few years. A lot of turmoil in the family, some physical abuse, a little bit of sexual abuse, and but I found sort of refuge from that in the sky. Basically, I ended up turning to the sky and putting all that on the ground, and seemed to work for a while. But as I went through I wasn't really getting any support other than just kind of my own personal growth stuff. But it all came to a head in my late 20s. All that stuff I'd sort of swept under the carpet. It came flooding out in quite a dramatic manner, actually. And when it came out, I recognized it for what it was. Okay, a lot of unresolved trauma here, but it was very disorienting, destabilizing. I'm knowing what I know now. If I'd actually gone into the psychiatric system, I would have gotten some psychotic disorder diagnosis. I was having anomalous beliefs, anomalous perceptions, really fluctuating a lot. It would have been an interesting case because it was one of those that didn't quite connect a lot of it.
Inconsistent.
Would have probably been schizoaffective disorder or something like that. but I knew it was pretty clear what was going on for me. I was scared, I was definitely scared, and I had a kind of healthy respect for the mental health system because some of my own family members had actually gone through it. Uncle, my grandmother, they'd had extreme states, kinds of experiences, been in the mental health system, psychiatric system. And I didn't hear very good stories about how they were treated. And so I was actually quite scared to turn to the mental health system myself, even though I felt like I needed help. So what I did instead was luckily I had the wherewithal I had a mindfulness practice already established. So I started doing a lot of diligent mindfulness practice and a lot of connection with my body, just exercise, good nutrition. I just started practicing a lot of self-care and eventually came through it without ever having to get any formal diagnosis or psychiatric drugs or anything. So I was quite fortunate, really.
Wow.
But it took a while. It was a few really difficult years, several years that were really, really difficult, and a lot of fear, panic attacks, a lot of unpleasant stuff. But got through it and then decided that I really wanted to help others going through these kind of processes, because I could see from the inside that there was actually a healing. It was an organic, spontaneous healing process was trying to take place. Like it wasn't my conscious choice, but you might say an unconscious part of me had initiated this kind of process to heal the earlier traumas. And it worked. I came out the other side feeling much healthier than I had felt ever, really. And so I thought, gosh, if I had just gone to a mainstream, mental health system, I probably would have got put on a whole bunch of drugs, given some unhelpful labels, and probably been a chronic mental health patient, most likely. And so
Wow.
I managed to get through it. And I thought, well, I'd really like to help others know that there's another way. I mean, obviously it varies a lot, with what people are holding, but it was quite clear to me from inside and also outside, already knowing some other people going through similar kinds of journeys.
So you really transcended the system, and so now you wanted to fix the system.
Yeah, or at least, well, that'd be great. I mean, I guess I don't have my delusions of grandeur have settled a bit, you might say. So whether I can fix the entire system, I don't really necessarily think I'm going to do that. But what I can do is at least join others who are offering more humanistic approaches to extreme states. So I often use the word extreme states because I want to be more inclusive. So there's, for example, terms like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder. These are the most common sort of terms for psychotic disorders in the mainstream system. But I find they're really unhelpful for the most part because they're kind of, well, first of all, they're trying to cram very unique experiences in many ways into just like these tidy little diagnostic labels. And they're also creating a sense of permanence. Like once you get such a label, diagnostic, diagnosis, the expectation in the system is you have that for your life. That's your sort of lifelong disorder, which is completely untrue. People change, they can change radically throughout. I mean, we'll look at my story. Many people fully recover. Many people, their experiences can really shift a lot. So one of the things that we've learned just in the research in general and my own research is it's much more helpful to actually look at extreme states as kind of an extreme of natural human experience. So there's like a continuum of human experience. And when you get to the extremes and we can at some point we kind of start to give it one of these labels, but ultimately it's really a continuum rather than black and white. So that's one aspect.
So Paris, can you tell, when you say, this is really important, when you say extreme states, can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, like if you think about it as a continuum, for example, multiple continuum, you might have a continuum of consensus reality. So here's a term that I use a lot. Consensus reality is the people within your community, your society generally have a consensus that this is what reality is, this is the nature of the world, the universe, etc. And as long as your own beliefs and behaviors conform to that, you're considered sane, right? They're sane because your beliefs and behaviors conform to consensus reality. But it gets tricky because you realize that different cultures, different spiritual traditions, religions, cultures, etc., they can have very different consensus realities from each other. But it doesn't mean that, like, for example, if you were a member of one sort of, say, religious tradition, and you're talking about people from a very different tradition, it wouldn't go over well to say that they're all psychotic, because they don't, because their beliefs are so different than mine. So we end up with this in this kind of space of, first of all, this idea of what even is kind of sanity, what's madness, etc. But let's just go back to the idea of consensus reality. So consensus reality, my community, my society generally believes this is the way things are. And as long as I kind of toe the line, I'm sane. And if my beliefs and behaviors start to go to the extreme, they start to seem like really far out, maybe really paranoid or deluded, extreme edges of what's generally accepted, that starts to be seen as delusional, starts to be seen as mad, psychotic. If my behaviors start acting in a way that other people can't make sense of, same thing. If my emotional state, if I start having emotions that aren't within a fairly narrow sort of frame of what's accepted intensity of emotion, then that's another kind of extreme. So basically, anytime somebody starts to have either internal experiences like emotions, impulses, or external experiences, maybe like behaviors or beliefs that maybe that they're talking about that go to the extremes of consensus reality, then that's what I'm calling extreme states, and that's where you start to enter the world of what we call mental health disorders. But I'm coming from a very humanistic lens where I think it's important to recognize a lot of it's subjective. Just like what is it? There's obviously a lot of problems with mainstream contemporary society. So if someone is acting in a way that's extreme, they might actually be acting in a way that's, yes, more problematic and dangerous, or they may be operating in a way that's actually healthier, the healthier edge. So it kind of becomes subjective in many ways, where you draw the line between what we call sanity or madness, or mental health disorder, mental illness. But so this is where I define it, is how I've defined it, is ultimately as human beings, we're all doing our best to try to meet our needs. And we all have needs. We're trying to meet our needs. Every action we take is an attempt to meet a need. Everything I do is an attempt to meet a need. I'm always trying to formulate beliefs about the world so that I can make sense of the world, navigate through the world, and again, try to meet my needs. So this is something that we're all doing. Now, if my beliefs and behaviors are quite different from others, there's a risk that I might be given a mental illness, mental health label or diagnosis. But as long as I'm still meeting my own needs effectively, and I'm not interfering with other people's needs, like I'm not acting in ways that are actually harming other people, where I'm coming from, I wouldn't call that a mental illness, because okay, the person might be acting in an unusual way or having unusual beliefs, but I don't think it's helpful to say that they're mentally ill just because they're not conforming to consensus reality. So that's where I differ from a lot of my colleagues. But however, if you take that further, where people do start to develop they start to develop very intense experiences, so very intense emotional experiences, or their beliefs become so extreme that they start to interfere with their ability to act effectively in the world and be able to meet their needs. Then I'm saying, okay, now there's a problem. This person's not able to effectively meet their needs anymore. They might be interfering with other people's needs in certain harmful ways. Okay, now there is some problem that needs to be addressed in some way. I still very cautious
when you
with
concede,
label.
yeah, I was going to say, would you concede then and call it mental illness?
I actually never use the word mental illness because I see that as a mixed metaphor. The mind being ill, first, and I think that causes a lot of problems. So I could say the mind can be disordered. It's like a mental health disorder, but the word mental illness I don't like, because I think you're implying, basically one of the problems that I see, and I'm going to throw out a lot of opinions here, but one of my problems with the mental health care system is there's this assumption that if somebody is having extreme experiences, like we've been talking about, that there must be something broken about the brain, right? The brain must be ill, physically ill or broken in some way, damaged or harmed or in some way, right? Neurotransmissions isn't working properly or something's going on wrong. And that is actually, I believe it's a false assumption. Just because and again, if you consider people like two different groups of people with different spiritual traditions, subjectively, they each seem a little bit mad. Like, I can't believe they believe that stuff. That seems really crazy. It's so different than what we believe. But it doesn't mean anything is actually wrong with their brain, you see? It's just because someone has different, really unusual beliefs doesn't mean that their brain's actually broken or diseased.
So you seem to be comparing defense mechanisms that people develop because of whatever traumas or stuff they'd gone through to a different social spiritual construct that people are trained and traditionalized in.
Yeah, that's right. So So rather than jump immediately to the assumption that there's something wrong physiologically with this person, especially with the brain,
Right.
and we need to throw drugs at the problem, because that's typically what happens, right? This
Yes.
person has unusual beliefs, unusual behaviors. They must have a brain disease. We need to fix it with drugs, and that's what happens. And my experience and research and belief, I think that's a really serious problematic set of assumptions. That, I mean, sometimes it could be true. There, you know, in some cases there can actually be something wrong. You know, obviously with things like Alzheimer's and other, you know, vascular dementia and Parkinson's or whatever, yeah, there is actually something wrong with the brain and it's causing these kinds of problems. But I think in I'd say the lion's share of people who are diagnosed with a mental health disorder, initially, I would say there's probably not anything particularly wrong or broken with the brain. And if you jump to that assumption and start throwing lots of, you know, psychiatric or other drugs at the problem, then you actually can, ironically, then you can actually cause a brain disease. So when someone once you start putting someone on psychiatric medications, you are starting to manipulate the neurotransmissions, and then you're starting to create problems within the brain that may or may not have actually been there to begin with. So now
if they weren't dead now, you're killing them.
Yes, now you end up with two problems. You have the initial issue, I'm going to call it issue, not necessarily, and then now they develop a dependency on psychiatric medications, which has a whole another can of worms that you're creating. And so, based upon the mental illness model or medical model, because we automatically jump to something wrong with the brain and we jump to meds, so often we end up making what could be a relatively simple situation far more complicated than it needs to be. And we create what's likely to be a more transient condition. We're going to turn that into something that's more likely to become a chronic condition. And the research is actually very clear on this. There's a really good book called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, who really details all the short-term and long-term research on psychiatric medication. And initially, the drug companies were doing long-term research on, you know, antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiolytics, et cetera. But what they kept finding out was when they did, double-blind placebo studies, once they got to a year or longer, the people on the placebos were doing better. Mostly, obviously it varies, but when you look collectively, they were generally doing better than the people on the drugs. So what they found is the first 6 months, the people taking the psychiatric medications were typically doing better because they were getting symptom relief. You know, they were getting some relief from the intense emotions and experiences. But when they stayed on for a year or longer, there was a turning point where those on the long-term use of medication were more likely to develop a chronic depression or a chronic anxiety disorder or a chronic psychosis, whereas those who weren't ever put on the medication were more likely to recover. So what we find in the field with medication use is you typically find a theme of short-term benefit with the drugs and long-term harm. And that's what emerged in my own book. And especially it's huge in psychosis because in the World Health Organization has actually done a 25-year longitudinal study of 13 countries around the world. And what they found for schizophrenia, diagnosis of schizophrenia, and what they found was the countries who used the most amount of psychiatric treatment, psychiatric medication, had by far the worst long-term outcomes. And the poorest countries of the world, like India, I'm trying to remember what it was, India, Colombia, Nigeria, and some others, had by far the lowest use of psychiatric sort of medication treatment, had the best long-term, actually more like, for example, in India.
How are we determining?
We're talking 70% full recovery rates.
Full recovery.
Full
without any kind of psychological treatment, or
no psych. So these were, for the most part. So this was this was just natural research. They were just they weren't actually.
What about life expectancy? Do you know anything about that?
This particular study didn't look at that. However, that's another set of studies that I could talk about. And that it's true actually that long-term psychiatric drug use is definitely correlated with shorter all-cause mortality as well as just shorter lifespan. Yeah, there's a significant correlation there. That's right. But that kind of takes you back to, I guess there's two parts to this. You have to challenge the current paradigm, right? Which is basically that all extreme states must be something wrong with the brain and you need to throw drugs at it. And the problem is it doesn't actually pan out. And if you do that, you actually, what we see is this pattern of making causing a much worse long-term conditions and reducing the likelihood that people will actually experience more genuine recovery. Whereas if people can get more psychosocial treatment, which usually involves things like, psychotherapy, counseling, nutrition, and just basic self-care, and just generally sort of trusting the process, you might say, supporting this kind of healing process, this organic healing process, that actually have much higher rates of recovery.
Wow.
It's a very different model.
Fascinating. You said a lot of things and I have a lot of questions on it. And like I told you before the show, my teachers in school always told me that when my parents went to, PTA, the teachers would always say that he asks really good questions, which is one of the reasons they wanted to kick me out of class. But I think I'm going to capitalize on that now because I have a few questions on what you just said. First of all, your story is fascinating, and congratulations to you that you pull through in that way. That's awesome. And then to go and take it and use it to help others, I hear a lot of passion and conviction in what you're doing. So you're looking essentially to destigmatize what everyone's calling mental illness, and to see it more as a mental construct that's and I want to understand that a little better. But I think the idea of seeing the so-called mental illness as more of a nurture, issue is something that probably many mental health professionals can accept. Okay. The question is, would you say that most people struggling with severe, what they call severe Axis 1 mental illness, are being medicated because they are a risk to, risk to themselves or a risk to others, or are they being medicated just because they're weird and quirky and delusional? Because how are we going to reconcile when somebody is a danger or a risk and we have to put them on medication because of that?
Yeah. So, right, we're talking about, and I also noticed there's somebody asked a question about the factor of recovery due to community support. And I just want to say, yes, absolutely. The collectivistic societies generally had the best recovery rates. So those who had strong communities typically had the best recovery rates. And also those who tend to have the spiritual understanding of their experience had better recovery rates. So there's a strong correlation with that. If people had a more spiritual, that yes, there's some extreme stuff happening here, but there's something spiritual about that. Like there's, potential for growth or maybe accessing into other dimensions of reality that others maybe aren't accessing so easily, then they tend to have better outcomes.
Is that like a form of acceptance? Is that because it's a form of
first of all, it's both for yourself, absolutely, right? If you like, okay, I'm going through some personal healing or spiritual journey, that's gonna be a lot easier than there's something wrong with my brain.
Got it. Beautiful.
You have a lot less fear. And also other people are gonna treat you differently. Other people think you have something wrong with your brain. They're gonna be a lot more afraid of you than if they think that, okay, this person's had some severe trauma or they're having some kind of spiritual emergency. They're going to be a lot more compassionate and less fearful. So
you're going to carry, you're going to carry yourself differently, and that's going to cause others to experience you differently?
Well, both and, yeah, it's kind of, I'd say the cause goes in both directions.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, people, they treat you differently, which helps me to, be more compassionate to myself, vice versa. So yeah, I just want to put that out there because I saw the question. Now, as far as safety is a really important one. So basically, if you look at psychosis, you're talking about neuroleptics, or also called antipsychotics, which actually a better term is major tranquilizers, because they're really not so much. What they really do is they shut down the parts of particularly the dopaminergic, the dopamine-based, E2 particularly, but anyway, dopamine-based receptors in the brain, which are particularly associated with prefrontal and executive functioning, and they create a kind of cognitive and emotional straitjacket, you might say, but they're not actually antipsychotic. Like, so people, if they're hearing voices or having unusual beliefs and things, it's unlikely that that's actually necessarily going to go away when they're on the drugs. But what happens is they have less salience. So if you take this as a tranquilizer, things are going to be less charged. The world is going to feel less intense. Naturally, my emotions are going to be turned down. And then when that happens, since there's so much less charge going on in my experience, my entire behavior is going to typically be dulled down, and I'm going to be tranquilized, basically. So antipsychotic's kind of a misnomer. It's really more a tranquilizer, but it helps you understand the drug better if you put it in that term. Now, it's understandable. So if somebody's like freaking out and have really heightened states of maybe rage or terror, paranoia, and you give them a tranquilizer, there's probably less likely, at least for that period of time, that they're going to do harm, right? Because they're not freaking out. But the problem is, it's not that simple. So first of all, the tranquilizers tend to, again, like all the other drugs, they have short-term benefits, but there's this problem where and it's very clear across the research, long-term research, that those who are put on these drugs and then kept on them sort of prophylactically, the idea is, okay, you have psychosis, I'm going to put you on antipsychotic, and we'll keep you on them so you won't have psychosis again. That's the thinking, right? Or you'll minimize your likelihood of having it again. But what actually happens is, it's true for the first 6 months to a year where those on the drugs actually are less likely to have another psychotic episode, or if they do, they'll maybe be less intense. But by the time you get beyond a year, 2 years, what you find is the opposite, that actually the ones who used no drugs or use them very judiciously, like instead of just, heavy-handedly, actually had much higher recovery rates. They learned how to manage their emotions a lot better. So they learned how to manage the emotions that were getting them in trouble, leading to paranoia or leading to, these kinds of experiences. Whereas those who stay on the drugs actually end up more likely to develop a chronic psychotic condition. They actually end up having more and more and more psychoses, and needing more and more drugs to try to manage. So when you actually follow long-term, the people who are put on the drugs long-term actually have higher risk to benefit ratio in the long-term. They actually become more risk to themselves and others in the long-term, even though in the short-term it might be helpful. So what the best methods have done that have managed that problem, so I'll name a couple. There's Soteria houses, Soteria homes. The first one was in San Francisco, I believe it would have been in early 80s. And now there's a few around the world. And then open dialogue approach, which was developed in Lapland, Finland, and which is basically a family therapy kind of model. So and there's some other approaches that are similar, but what they do, they come from the approach that rather than saying what's wrong with you, we ask what happened to you, right? So it's a whole different framework. And there's an expectation that, if someone's going to go into these extreme states, almost certainly some kind of traumatic experiences have happened. And the research really pans that out. I'll talk more about that later. And so if we treat them in that way, a bit more compassionately and humanely, and actually try to support them to go through a kind of healing process, try to heal and recover from the trauma that they've experienced, they're much more likely to actually experience a full recovery. And the drugs, even though it might help manage the symptoms, you might say, in the long term, it actually interferes with the recovery process. So what all these kind of models do is they use the minimum amount of drugs possible. So like the open dialogue approach, which has the best recovery rates in the world, 85% full recovery rates for people would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. They try no drugs at all initially, and if they're having a hard time sleeping, they'll give them benzodiazepines just to help them sleep, basically, initially. Because oftentimes if a person can get sleep, the psychosis tends to subside. Oftentimes it's as simple as that. Just this person has just not slept for 5 days, and everybody goes a bit mad when that happens. So they might use some sleeping meds just to get them to sleep. But they try to minimize no antipsychotics, everything else. And they get some really intensive family therapy, basically, is what it is, going. And then they only bring in the meds for short periods of time as needed. For most people, they don't need it at all. And for some that are really struggling with intense emotions, they bring it in temporarily, and then they try to tape them off as soon as possible. And what they've done, they found, this is over 25 years now, they have recovery rates of over 80% full recovered off all medication, which is really great. So much better than what we have in the West, where we're talking 5% recovery rates kind of thing. So that's an example.
Where are these treatments? Where are these?
Well, that's developed in Finland, but actually that's being taught around the world now. In fact, I don't know a whole lot about it specifically, but I know in New York, I think it's called the Open Parachute Project, something like that. It's developed in New York, where they're using this model, and other parts of the world too. I can't name them all on top of my head, but I know there's many parts of the world that are actually starting to use that approach. And California, et cetera. And then the Soteria home is kind of similar. You create a cocoon around a person, loving, supportive cocoon, where you understand that, yeah, they might be harmful to self and others. So we do need to kind of watch them carefully and make sure it doesn't happen. But we're going to minimize the use of drugs. We're going to support a process, whatever needs to happen. We're going to, give them room to, if they need to go into a room and scream or do artwork or beat on pillows, whatever they need to do to help this process emerge and resolve. And they let that happen. And again, they showed, when they were doing formal research on this in the 80s, they were showing also about 80-ish% full recovery rates off all meds, full recovered, not having further psychotic episodes.
Wow. So the question begs itself. I'm sure you've done the research. Would you say that a large percent of psychosis is not biological? Would you say there's any percent of psychosis that's biological?
Sure,
would the treatment be the same? And then I want to go a little bit into treatment, but let's first start with that question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's biological can mean a lot of things. Like if you give someone a hit of LSD, they're going to have experiences that we would call psychosis, and we would say it's biological because the LSD is affecting the neurotransmission in the brain, et cetera. In fact, that's actually one of the theories. LSD was one of the things that sort of spawned the neurotransmitter theory of psychosis, because, oh, look, you take this drug and you have this kind of psychotic reaction. So maybe people in psychosis are having the same thing spontaneously. However, after like billions of dollars and many years of research, we haven't been able to find that. We haven't been able to find anomalous brain activity associated specifically with psychosis. What we have found it with is trauma. The people with that extreme trauma, with obviously drug and alcohol use.
So what's the correlation of psychosis with trauma?
Really high.
Really high correlation?
Yeah, I actually have the figures right here. Let me give you 1 sec. But essentially, they've done a lot of research looking at adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
And what they particularly found was that, well, here's one study that was done in the UK, covering 8,500 people, so a really large study. And they found that those who've had 3 different types of trauma were 18 times more likely to develop psychosis than the average person. And people who've had 5 types of significant trauma in their life were 193 times more likely to develop psychosis. And here's another study, Holland, Dutch, 4,000 people. So this actually followed people who were initially free from psychosis, and then just followed them for 3 years and saw, who developed psychosis. And what they found was that those who'd experienced child abuse were 9 times more likely to develop psychosis, and those who experienced the most severe types of child abuse, I don't remember exactly how they identified that, but particularly severe child abuse, were 48 times more likely to develop psychosis. So these are the factors these are huge, right? Massive factors. Whereas if you look at sort of genetics, for example, you're only finding like 0.5% differences between certain gene types and development of psychosis. So it's very, very little, if anything at all. So that's important. Trauma is definitely a much bigger factor. And I guess I just want to finish your last question as far as biology and psychosis. So obviously you can take drugs and things like that, and that can give you a psychotic experience, and that certainly has a biological characteristic to it. But the neurotransmitter theory, right, that mental illness, I don't really like that word, but it's mental health conditions, depression, anxiety disorders, psychosis, are caused by something wrong with the neurotransmission systems. That theory, as far as, and I've been following this for a very long time, it has been pretty soundly debunked. Like, for example, look at serotonin and depression, right? The belief was that people with low serotonin were more likely to have major depressive disorder. But then it turned out that actually, when they were actually looking at different degrees of serotonin for people with these diagnoses, they were just as likely to have too much as too little. It just didn't correlate. The serotonin sort of utilization within a person's brain wasn't correlating with the diagnosis. And this also went for other disorders. So that's actually been dropped. And you'll even find many of the top mainstream leaders in psychiatry will just actually come right out and said that. That look, the biochemical imbalance theory, yes, it was an interesting theory, but it's actually not true. Now, it doesn't mean, obviously, drugs are going to have an effect. If you give someone psychoactive drugs, they're going to affect your neurotransmitters and they're going to cause certain states of mind. And when you've been on those drugs long enough, your brain will adapt to those drugs and you actually will develop a kind of neurotransmitter imbalance, biochemical imbalance. But that's actually come from long-term use of drugs. So anybody using recreational drugs, alcohol, et cetera, or psychiatric drugs long-term will almost certainly have some kind of imbalance. But as far as happening spontaneously, the theory hasn't panned out.
Okay, let's take a question from Aaron Herzog. Aaron was actually the one who reached out to you initially, so thank you, Aaron,
Hi,
once
Aaron.
again for pulling through. And I have so much more to ask you on this. So Aaron, take it away and let's do it.
Hi, Dr. Williams. I'm following you for a while. My first few client was psychosis. I discovered the concept of dissociation. I did a lot of research and I found you. So my understanding was that actually Lohler, someone I've done, I'm not sure I pronounce his name well. He was the person who came up with the schizophrenics. And he actually said that he refers to something Janet, which he was the person who came up with the concept of disassociation. And schizophrenia is actually a dissociation disorder. And then it became two different things somewhere down the road. You agree that most schizophrenia is actually a dissociation disorder?
Yeah, so it's been a while since I've kind of looked at, I know what you're talking about, Krapelin and Janet. So my understanding was a lot of information came out later that showed that a lot of the people who were getting diagnosed with schizophrenia had actually, what was it? There was actually a brain disease. I'm trying to remember what it was that, at my time, maybe it'll come later. So diagnosable brain disease, like something like, say, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, right, Huntington's, these are actual neurological diseases that are well established. The number of people actually had a neurological disease, which has a very different course, by the way. Like, I mean, you know, you typically have a very shortened lifespan, not related to any drug treatment. And so there was kind of a mistake that was happening back then. You know, they didn't have the diagnostic tools to see what was going on. So there actually, for a lot of the Krapelin's patients, there was something biological happening. But you're talking more like dementia. It's very different than psychosis. So they're actually having like dementia type symptoms. So I'm very much, yeah, my beliefs have really gone the way of the trauma approach, that I think the trauma is really, and with severe trauma dissociation, is a really much more helpful framework for making sense of, you know, what's happening to so many, the lion's share, the large majority of people who are getting psychotic disorder diagnoses. Because as I showed just from those few studies, very, very high correlations of trauma and psychosis. And when trauma is severe enough, we will start to dissociate. So this is very well established. You know, when we go into first we go into a threat response, right? We go into fight, flight, and then we go into collapse, shut down, dissociate. When things get too overwhelming for us to tolerate, we start to dissociate. And as we start to go in down that far in the trauma response, now we are opening the door to having a more of an extreme state psychotic kind of reaction. No doubt about that.
Okay,
How would you treat it? Would you treat it somatically, EMDR, or cognitively, CBT?
Yeah, so dissociation is really interesting. So absolutely, that's what. So my work has very much become about trauma now. Like I'm actually traveling around New Zealand doing lots of trauma trainings, and that because I feel like that's really the place to go when you want to support people with it. With virtually most, if not almost all of these mental health conditions that get put in the DSM. Most of those can be, I think, connected to some kind of trauma. And remember, trauma is very subjective. So for one person who's very sensitive, it might seem like a fairly minor trauma to somebody else, but for them, it's enough to get overwhelmed and to start to go into a kind of chronic trauma response. And then if it's severe enough, they can go into what we think of as psychosis. And so as far as treatment, I'm a strong believer of kind of the mindful somatic approaches. So yeah, like EMDR, internal family systems, sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, Hakomi, mindful somatic psychotherapy. So all of these are kind of doing the same thing. The basic framework is that in the same way that your body knows how to heal like a broken bone, right? So if I break my arm, a doctor, can put a cast on it, but no doctor can actually heal my arm for me. My body has to actually do the healing work itself. But I have to protect it with a cast or something. And it's the same thing with psychological healing. So rather than using the word illness, I would say injury. So if someone, like often I prefer the term post-traumatic stress injury rather than disorder, because it's not necessarily a disorder per se, because any of us can have that kind of response. But they've been injured on a psychological level. And so what we need to do is create a cast. We need to create safety and resourcing for this person so they can actually do the vulnerable work. They can let their own psyche basically do the vulnerable work of resolving the trauma. And there's different ways that looks, but generally speaking, from the approaches I draw from, it's if we can actually just let what we can trust there's a deeper unconscious part of me that knows exactly what needs to happen to heal. And there's been certain feelings like rage and terror and despair that have been trapped in my system. And there's been sort of somatic armoring. So we call that actual sensations and tensions. My posture will change. So that's all kind of locked up in my system. And then because I have this very powerful neocortex, human beings have a very powerful neocortex and prefrontal cortex, we have the capacity to repress all that stuff. So we actually end up with a stalemate. But one part of me is trying to release all that, trying to release the terror, the rage, the despair, and all the sensations and the memories, the imagery that associated with the trauma. But this other part of me, this conscious part of me, I don't want to feel that stuff. Who wants to feel that? So I repress it. So we end up in we locked in a stalemate. So the treatment then is learning how to gently take the lid off, very gently through mindfulness, which is where you just observe the fear, observe the sadness, observe the sensation. And just allow that stuff to start moving through your system. It's quite beautiful. I love this work because it takes a lot of the pressure off your therapist. Like all we really have to do is make sure we begin by fostering a lot of resourcing and safety. And once that's there, then we just gently guide them to just hang out with the experience in a really truly mindful, open, curious way. And the trauma will just naturally start to move out of their system. It's really amazing. And then the person will start to feel lighter and lighter. And with psychosis, it's just, you're talking about, for the most part, people who've just gone a bit further. They've gone into a trauma response and that's gone further into a more dissociative kind of realm. But ultimately, the work ends up being the same. You just have to start typically with a lot more resourcing. So just teach them the basic. So like I love the acronym FREES, F-R-E-E-S, for self-care. F is food, so I'm just careful about what I ingest, trying to avoid drugs, alcohol, trying to maximize nutritious food, not junk food. And then R and E is rest and exercise, so a nice balance of rest and exercise. The next E is enjoyable activity, so do something enjoyable, even if I have to fake it till I make it. And then S is social connection, so make sure I maintain some kind of healthy social connections with others. And so I teach people basic self-care like that. I give them some tools to manage distressing emotions, and I start having them get into their body. And because the way out of dissociation is embodiment. Dissociation, by definition, you're basically disembodied. And so I have them start to, feel their five senses, feel their feet on the floor, feel their posture, maybe even, practice pushing against my hands. What is it like to feel your power, your strength? So I have them just do things to help them feel more embodied. And then we can, when they're ready, we can start to work on the actual unresolved trauma, whatever that might be.
Well, that's fascinating. So one of the things I'm wondering is, can you explain how let's call it the childhood trauma that we're looking at manifests in delusions or in speaking to people who others don't see or hearing voices that others don't hear? How is that manifesting, through the unresolved trauma?
Yeah. So one of the things, it's important to make a distinction between developmental trauma and acute trauma, shock trauma. So, if someone has like a horrible car accident, we would often call that like a shock trauma or acute trauma. Whereas developmental trauma is trauma associated with our upbringing. So like obviously if we're abused by our caretakers, somewhere, or neglect, abuse. And this can go on early enough to where I can't even remember. Or maybe it's by babysitters, but typically as children, any significant relational harm, you could probably put in the developmental trauma basket. Now, as children, I imagine most of you are aware of the idea of the attachment theory. So basically, we have these interesting dilemmas that we have to confront from birth, really, and we still confront them. This is basically about my needs for autonomy and my needs for connection. I say they're kind of like diametrically opposed in some way. On one hand, I need to feel a sense of autonomy and empowerment, and choice and freedom, etc. But on the other hand, I need to feel like love and companionship and connection and support, right? So these are really important. And when we're raising children, it's important that we support them through both of that. We make it very clear that we love them and we support them, and those needs are getting met. And also we support their autonomy. So when they start, getting adventurous and curious and running around the house and things, obviously within reason and within safety limits, we let them have as much freedom as they can, so they can start developing their sense of autonomy and freedom and choice and empowerment. And if it all goes well, they develop what's called a secure attachment style. Basically, if those two sets of needs are met well enough, they have a secure attachment style. Now, if they're not, they develop an insecure attachment style. So, and that can go in one of two directions. They can go in the direction of feeling really avoidant. So they feel sort of comfortable in their sense of self and autonomy, but they feel really uncomfortable, a lot of fear in connection with other people. Sometimes we call that engulfment anxiety, where they feel like they're losing their sense of self when they relate to others. So we often call that an avoidant, insecure attachment style. And then the other extreme is the opposite, where they feel really anxious about being alone, being abandoned, being in their own sort of experience, and then they cling to other people. We often call that anxious or ambivalent, insecure attachment style. So these are sort of the two extremes. And then disorganized attachment style is when they actually have both really strong, when they have both intense engulfment anxiety, oh my God, I'm going to lose my sense of self, and intense abandonment anxiety, I'm going to get abandoned. And so then we call that disorganized. And sometimes those people get the label borderline personality disorder, that push-pull kind of thing, where they're terrified to be in a relationship, but they're also terrified to be alone. So the attachment frame is really helpful. Now, nobody gets through childhood perfectly, I think. I think we can probably all relate a little bit to all of that stuff. But if it becomes extreme, especially in the disorganized insecure attachment style, what'll happen is we'll develop, Irvin Yalom talks a lot about this, we can develop the extreme engulfment and abandonment fears so strong that they become intolerable and overwhelming. And my own psyche will start to generate experiences to try to help me to manage. So for example, I'll start having more and more watch over kinds of experiences, like what we often call, it's actually both benevolent and malevolent. Like, for example, I can hear when people hear voices and you really talk to them about hearing voices, like instead of just, here, take these drugs, stop talking about it, and you actually really talk to them about it, which I really believe in. You'll find almost everyone will actually have both positive and negative voices. They'll have some voices that are really encouraging and they really enjoy. And sometimes people feel, talking to God, and maybe they are. And sometimes they'll have, really scary voices, like really persecutory voices, kill yourself and all this horrible stuff. But anyway, regardless, there's a sense of I'm important and I'm cared for. Even good or bad, there's all these entities that actually are paying attention to me, right? They're putting all this attention on me, and they really care about me. Whether they want to hurt me or not, it's almost irrelevant. And in a way, that kind of neutralizes that abandonment anxiety.
Fascinating.
So when someone has intense abandonment anxiety, they're more likely to head in the direction of hearing voices or paranoia, this kind of thing. And then the other extreme is like the heroic striving. So these are the two kinds of experiences you're going to see in psychosis. You can hear being watched over, whether it's voices or just general paranoia stuff, and heroic striving is the other sort of extreme. And that heroic striving is about maintaining my sense of autonomy and power. It's kind of the other side of that spectrum. right? So if I start to see myself as this Messiah or this heroic figure, very powerful, saving the world or whatever that might be, then that's gonna solve the sort of engulfment, the fear of losing myself, the engulfment anxiety that gets overwhelming. That's gonna sort of tend to that, because now I have a very strong sense of self. So it makes sense. These are actually, you might look at them as compensatory strategies to manage these really core
Coping
fundamental
mechanisms.
fears.
Coping mechanisms for survival.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And so it makes
Wow.
sense.
That's
And
incredible.
so that's why there's so much correlation with particularly really early wounding and psychosis. So if someone's had like a really amazing, like, first few years of their life, really loving parents and all of that, and then some horrible stuff happens later, they're a lot less likely to go into psychosis because they probably got a pretty, secure attachment style. And those two core anxieties I just talked about are probably not like super overwhelming, at least initially. But if someone's had some really rocky beginning to the world, their first few years of life, they're much more likely than later when they get overwhelmed that they could tip over into a kind of psychotic response.
Wow. Okay, can we take a question from
Yes.
Reezy? Let's see if your mic is working, but Reezy, go ahead. No. Okay, your mic is not working. All right, well, see if you can get it to work and then we'll raise your hand again, okay? Okay, that was fascinating. I did not understand that was what was going on in the psyche, so to say, of the person who's having delusions or voices or grandiosity or what was the word you could have said? Striving?
Yeah, heroic striving.
Heroic striving. Thank you.
Heroic striving. Yeah, I try to avoid the pathological terms and come from more humanistic. So like instead of saying paranoid, I mean, it's not that I have anything particularly against it, but it is pathological. I'd say it's like being watched over. And what's quite interesting is people who have these extreme experiences often end up, well, there is a whole nother story, but they're often tapping into the shadow of the collective society. Like, for example, there's people that were paranoid about the government watching them. They were actually right. Everyone else out there crazy.
Didn't one of the presidents say, was it Roosevelt? Who was it who said, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean no one's out to get me?
Doesn't mean I'm wrong or something. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And so this is actually something, there's often seeds of truth in these kinds of anomalous beliefs. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So another question I have about this is, I mean, you spoke about the somatic kind of interventions, the mindfulness, the IFS, the sensory motor interventions that will help the dissociated or the psychotic patient remove the lid and start letting some of it out. But yeah. I'm wondering, can you tell me relationally, from a relational perspective, the relationship between the therapist as an object, so we're talking about people at very early childhood trauma or childhood neglect, and how much of this relational piece between therapist and client is reparative in its own right, besides the actual sort of direct intervention that you're doing. Like, is this secure? If we create a really, really secure attachment for this, I'm just fantasizing. I don't actually haven't really worked with too many people with psychosis, but I'm just imagining that if we could really create that environment of attachment, notwithstanding or through the psychotic experience that they're having, so we can actually go into their world with them, really sit in that experience with them. Will that potentially repair the traumatic attachment?
Yeah, in fact, that's what most of your work's going to be. So if you're working with the worried well that had a bad car accident, you could pretty quickly jump into doing this kind of trauma processing I was talking about earlier. But if you're talking with someone who's actually had a significant sort of psychotic, they're going into some extreme states, most likely you're dealing with some significant sort of developmental, early attachment-based trauma, most likely. Again, I was going to use the word most likely, and never say never, never say always. But what that means is the lion's share, if you're going to work, is going to be in the relational realm. It's going to be repairing the relational ruptures. And so, like, I'm a big fan of Carl Rogers. I think he was way ahead of his time. So really practicing, genuineness, empathy, unconditional positive regard, right? These three qualities, and to actually, because oftentimes someone's deeply wounded, they've never even had a healthy, secure relationship. They don't even know what it is. And so to actually be able to offer that, like, there's one place in this world you can actually be with someone who both cares about you, like I really genuinely care. I feel love and compassion for you, this person. And I want to support your autonomy. I want to support your freedom. I want to support your choice. I want you to support you to be able to, have a self and meet your needs and things. Because that's what a healthy relationship is both of those, the care and the love and support, and also supporting them to be authentic.
Right.
And so, and I think the Rogerian approach is wonderful. Like, it's really naming those three qualities that we bring in as therapists that can actually do that. And for a lot of these clients, that alone is going to be extremely healing.
Yeah. And
one thing you want to be careful of is you don't want to jump into direct trauma processing too early. That's something that a lot of therapists do, because it's fun, it's exciting work. But if you have to make sure that safety is in place first, you have to make sure that this person can manage difficult feelings without getting into trouble. You want to make sure that they can, that they trust me, as a therapist, that they can actually be vulnerable, and that there's enough alliance and trust there. And then, and only then, do I actually do anything more serious as far as that, where you intentionally go into the traumatic event and you intentionally sort of work that through. So for some serious clients, you might never even do that. You might spend years just simply doing relational, kind of Rogerian type approach.
Well, what I'm thinking is, my thinking here, and tell me what you think about this, is to the contrary. If we can actually go into the place of this person that nobody else can accept. So when they're describing or discussing some delusion, some psychotic experience that they're having, the tendency would be for people to say, knock it off, that's not really happening, come to your senses. But what if we could actually fantasize or go into that world with them? So they're having, a deeply corrective experience in that somebody's actually accepting them the way they are now. That's what I'm wondering, if that's part of the treatment.
Yeah, actually, I did an internship a few years ago at a hospital working with a lot of dementia patients, so a lot of Alzheimer's, and they're really deep into some non-consensus beliefs. And we were actually doing kind of drama therapy, where you would actually do exactly what you're describing. You would go into their world with them. And the thinking was that when people were getting into these quite severe stages of dementia, so it's kind of a different topic, but there's no doubt relationship. There's going to be a natural desire to the traumas that have been repressed because the defenses are getting undermined by the dementia. They start to emerge. And you can actually support them in resolving through that by being with them in a loving, caring way while you're sort of joining them in the story. And it was pretty cool, actually. Like, it was pretty amazing how you could see, even though some of these people had severe dementia, they couldn't remember one day to the next, but you could see their mood changing, like they were just becoming happier, lighter people. And so that was quite lovely, to be able to support them in that way. But going back to, like, say, someone with severe trauma or dissociation or psychosis, you would actually, here's how I do it. I'm very humble about my beliefs. Like, I realize that, we all do the best to make sense of the world, and we all tend to have an illusion that we understand the world probably a lot better than we really do. Who am I to say, if someone says, aliens are beaming messages into my brain, who am I to say they're not really? So the way that I approach this is I go, well, what's the need? So remember, everything that we do is an attempt to meet a need, consciously, unconsciously. So what's the need that's not getting met for them, that's keeping them in the, because they're obviously in a threat response. If they're having some kind of delusion, right, like CIA or aliens or somebody's trying to hurt me, there's obviously a threat response happening. The actual details may or may not be true. And it's actually, generally speaking, it's not my place to tell them whether it's true or not. And I don't know for most of the time. But what I can do is go, okay, sounds like you're really feeling I empathize. Sounds like you're really not feeling very safe. Hey, yeah, not feeling safe at all. Okay, well, how can we help you feel safe? So what we have to do is kind of like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have to start with those basic needs first. So you have to take the gun away from the head, whether it's imagined or not. We have to find a way to help them to feel safe first. And the worst thing I could do is go, nope, you're wrong. There's no aliens, there's no CIA. All that's going to do is put me in the enemy camp in their eyes. I'm just one more person that doesn't believe them. And that's the worst thing I could do. It'll just rupture our alliance. So what I'll do first is empathize. I'm not going to collude with the story. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, it's true or whatever. I'll empathize with the feelings and the needs. Sounds really scary. It sounds like, you're just really wanting to feel safe. Okay, how do we do that? Let's work together. How can we help you feel safe? And sometimes you might get really creative. As used an extreme example, maybe it feels safe for them to actually wear aluminum foil in their head, right? The classic cliche for mad prison. But maybe they actually do feel safer that way. Again, whether it has any objective truth doesn't really matter. As long as they feel safer, then go ahead and do whatever strategy you need to do to feel. And then once they feel safer, their whole nervous system settles. They can start to come out of the threat response. And now we could do some deeper work. And part of that work might be to gently challenge the belief. So like if it's a really difficult belief, I might go, well, how would you feel? Let's say they're feeling safer and they're trusting me. I'll be really clear. Look, I don't think it's my place to tell you you're right or wrong. However, I do wonder, if there might be some way that maybe you misinterpreted the situation, and if we can maybe just talk about it together. I can be your bouncing board, and I can help you try to make sense of what's actually happening. And then usually you can do it then. But if you try to do that prematurely, all you're going to do is reinforce their
You're gonna dig
beliefs.
deeper, dig their heels deeper in the sand. But
Exactly.
okay, so what is it? Explain to me how challenging the belief is helpful in the in the global picture. In other words, suppose you could start a debate with them and they say, okay, I see your point. This may not be true. There may not actually be a chip in my arm from the FBI, right? But how is that going to help them? Is that in some way creating more safety for them to actually look at the world more objectively? Like, what is it doing for them to challenge that particular thought?
Well, some beliefs, just the very nature of the belief is such that it's really, really hard for them to ever feel safe as long as they're holding that belief. I mean, if the belief actually turns out to be objectively true, okay, then you got to try to deal with that the best you can, right? Courage to change the things we can, serenity to accept the things we can't. But oftentimes, with this particular belief you're holding, it's really, really hard for this person to ever really feel safe. And I'm pretty sure objectively it's not actually true. There's some misinterpretation. So in that case, I'll probably will, once they're ready, be very careful, just gently challenge that, but do it very collaboratively. Like I'm not trying to impose my belief on them, but I'm just going, okay, what did you actually observe? So I go, what was it that you actually observed? And then when you made that interpretation or whatever, and then what might be an alternative interpretation? So it's a little CBT-ish, I realize, but for someone who's really holding on to like a particularly harmful belief, it can be helpful to get there eventually, but you got to start with the needs. You have to, or if you jump the gun, it's not going to work. I actually read an article about this, and I know it's controversial, so I'm a little bit hesitant to share it, but I will. So we find ourselves in society right now. We have two sets of people, with the whole COVID situation, that are actually really afraid of each other, right? We've kind of divided into two camps, you might say, where many of the people obviously are really afraid of getting COVID, and they've taken on the belief that that those who haven't got vaccinated are, they're just spreading germs everywhere, basically. And so they're terrified to be around the unvaccinated people. You've got that's an extreme, but I'm just saying the most extreme. And then you've got, on the other side, you've got people who are terrified of the vaccine, right? So without going into the objective so much, you end up with a kind of stalemate. It's really hard. It's really divisive. It's really polarizing. And it's like two people that have guns pointed at each other. And the only way you're going to solve it is that you have to kind of find a way to get the guns down and actually talk, right? We actually have to talk. As long as we keep feeling like we're threatening each other, we're never going to be able to sort of come out of this thing. So what we have to do is create enough safety that people can actually settle, and then they can actually communicate with each other. And I really didn't want to get into the research too much, but I decided, I actually kind of have to in this case, because this is one of those beliefs it's been really quite distorted, which is the fact that the people who aren't vaccinated are like these, they're just spreading the germ many, many times more than the vaccinated, which actually, when you look at all the peer-reviewed literature, and I went through 40 different research studies, and what we actually find there is the transmission rates are actually very similar. like, and this is like through, British medical journals. These are all like the Lancet. These are like major medical journals have all come up with the same conclusions that actually the rate of your personal safety varies. There's a lot of different research on that. I'll let people have their own opinions about that. But as far as transmitting to each other, they're not that different. Like the vaccinated, unvaccinated, there's not much difference in transmission. And I felt like it was actually important to really push that out there, because as long as people believe that those who choose not to get vaccinated are extremely dangerous, then you end up creating a divisiveness in society that's almost insurmountable. And so at least have people have that accurate information, so they're not so afraid of those who choose not to get vaccinated, because we have a lot of fear around that. So that's an example where I felt like, I actually do need to kind of challenge that belief, because otherwise I don't see how they're going to ever have dialogue with each other. So that's just one example. You might say we're entering into a kind of collective psychosis, and that there's extreme beliefs happening all over the place, right, on every side at the moment. But yeah, so that's just one example. But there's other examples, like I have clients who believe that everybody basically hates them and wants to kill them, right? They can't even go onto a bus because they just think that everybody, they hate me, they want to kill me. And so I had to actually challenge that. I had to go, okay, well, let's, once I had the alliance, tell me, what did you actually observe? Like, so you thought this woman on the bus hated you and wanted to kill you. What did you see? Well, she looked at me and she frowned. Okay. Is there any other interpretations? Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe it wasn't even about you. Maybe she had a fight with her boyfriend. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Oh. And so then we talked about this, and I said, why don't you try going on the bus and see if you can actually come up with some alternative interpretation, instead of jumping immediately to the conclusion that this person hates you. And it actually was really,
it would seem that people who are so traumatized are going to default, to everybody's after me because I'm so bad. I know I'm so bad because I was so neglected,
right.
And I just feel so bad. So, that sounds like a very cognitive intervention from treating trauma.
You've got a chicken and the egg. You've got a chicken and the egg situation here. It comes a self-reinforcing belief system.
Okay, all right.
Because yes, it's true. There's an internal, like you say, in this case for sure that I'm talking about right now. He had some unresolved trauma, which created a natural environment, a natural state of fear, right? And he was abused, and so he naturally believed that he had this feeling that people were wanting to harm him, because they actually were. He went through a period of his life as a child where people were actually wanting to harm him, not necessarily kill him, but they were hurting him. And so that state got stuck, and then he took that around with him, and that became a projection. He projected that out onto the world. That's
right.
exactly right. However, it's kind of like it's so entrenched, like where do you start exactly? So we had to start by actually, okay, here's one relationship where he feels safe with me. So we had to create that first. And then we can start to help him manage the anxiety and the fear. So I gave him that. And then we have to start to, we're kind of like at some point we have to resolve the trauma from his past, but we also he has to get on the bus so he can like buy his groceries. And this was in downtown San Francisco. So we had to kind of deal with the practical stuff as well. And so I just wanted to take enough of the edge off, to where basically, so we can, when you're in a state of fear, we jump to conclusions. That's one of the things that our brain does. Our executive functions go offline, and we quickly jump to friend or foe. Threat. We look for threat, and our mind doesn't think in a complex way.
Right.
So if I could actually get him, and it's CBT's thing, to start thinking in a little more complex way, what are some alternative interpretations? I know it's CBT, but in this case, we had to get some practical stuff on board for him.
Okay.
And it was working. We were able to get him on the bus.
If it's working, right? If he's open to
get him on the bus. And he came back, he goes, yeah, I thought, and we made a kind of game out of it where he could talk about, these alternative interpretations. And sometimes they're even kind of fun,
Right.
Start making stuff up creatively, and it's quite fun. And then we were able to actually start, once we kind of created enough safety in this environment as life, we could then start to go into the actual trauma. The sad thing with that particular case is I actually moved town when we kind of got to that point. I didn't get to do the deeper work. So I referred him to another therapist, but I've worked with a lot of other people with similar kinds of persecutory beliefs. And it's kind of this, you kind of have to there's a juggling bit, safety, relationship with me, maybe enough gently challenging some of the more extreme beliefs so that, they're not just creating so much fear for this person. And then when they're ready, we can start to gently dip our toes into the trauma.
Okay. Paris, we have a couple more questions before we have to
Yep.
go. So I want to jump to them. Taivi, go ahead. And then Aaron, you'll go next.
Yeah, sounds very fascinating. I was just wondering if there is
Hold on, Paris, do you recognize that bridge?
I sure do. You know,
Okay.
I've been on that, I've stood on that hill, in fact.
All
Yeah.
right, just making sure.
if there ever is a case where it's not trauma related. I had a client where I couldn't really find anything that happened in his history. And you mentioned something about perception. He is a little bit on the spectrum, I believe, and he wasn't diagnosed. So I'm wondering if he could have had some perception of trauma that could have caused him with psychosis. He's officially schizophrenic, but none of his siblings have anything, and there's no history of trauma. Just wondering how that fits in.
Yeah, there's always going to be cases where we don't know what's sort of underlying causal factors for this particular situation. It could be really early trauma, like pre-infantile amnesia. Excuse me, pre-infantile amnesia. Maybe they just can't remember what happened. Like oftentimes, for example, even as like a 6-month-old going to surgery can end up with a lifelong trauma. It could be very serious trauma, for example.
Wow.
Or it could be something maybe more biological in the sense of, we know that pesticides and various environmental poisons and certain drugs and all of that are associated with doing certain kinds of neurological injuries that can then have certain effects. So with some people, you just have to be in the kind of easygoing and the not knowing. So the way I treat, I still would do the same thing. I would, always start with safety, building the therapy. I'm trying to be Carl Rogers, try to build the therapeutic relationship, try to teach them some skills to manage, their distressing experiences. Look at what resources can they do, people, places, and activities to manage the distress. So we have to always get that down first, no matter what situation is. And then we can look at the particularities of what they're struggling with. And I do it from a needs perspective. So ultimately, if we're able to meet our needs fairly effectively, we're pretty happy, regardless of whether I have some, any kind of physiological ailment or neurological ailment or whatever it might be, unresolved trauma. It always comes down to the need. So what are the needs this person's having a hard time meeting? And how can I help them to actually meet them? It's on a very practical level. And if there's some intense emotional charge that's going on, there's something intense on that level, somatic or emotional charge, then when they're ready, I'll go ahead and immerse them into that experience. So I've actually done a lot of really interesting work with people who clearly had some really early trauma that they will probably never remember, but they're actually able to resolve it. And that's how we did it. We actually just went into the actual felt sense of it mindfully once they're ready. And so let's say, for example, oh my God, I feel this churning in my solar plexus. Okay, go ahead and just really, bring your attention to that churning. What are the qualities? Where's it located? Epicenter, size, shape, color, temperature. Really get into it. And as you hang out with that, what comes up next? Just a memory, a thought, an image, another sensation. And then yeah, I'm having this memory, or maybe I'm having this, other feeling, this emotion starting to come up. Okay, let's just hang out with that. So we call this organic unfolding, and all these different methods share that. Great, let's hang out with, I'm starting to feel kind of scared. Okay. See if you can just be with the fear and know it's not actually going to hurt you. You're safe now, but just feel into the fear, etc. And you basically just do this unfolding through the layers. And oftentimes this real healing will happen and the person feels lighter and better. And we never know exactly what the problem was, but yet the same sort of strategy still works. But it's interesting.
Okay, Aaron, let's take one last question.
So I had actually another question, but that's a long question, so I guess I will leave it for next time when they come up.
Okay.
So I will just my intention when searching for someone like you and bringing up to the show was to actually change the mindset, if I may say, from the professional world that schizophrenia is something that we could cure and people are getting out of it. So I just want to, if you don't mind, to summarize, how do you look at schizophrenia and what's the recovery percentage for people who have schizophrenia, and which approach would you recommend?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I would probably drop the word schizophrenia. The Japanese have even there's a few countries now that have dropped that term, and they're using words like if you translated them, psychosis, vulnerability syndrome, things like that. Just because the word schizophrenia is such a stigmatizing term, and it tends to imply permanent, like, it's a permanent condition. So that's the first thing I would probably, just shift the language a little bit, and even educate the person about that. Actually many people have these kinds of experiences, and they're able to actually recover, and recover can mean different things too. What do we mean by recovery? So for example, people hear voices. So for a lot of people, the voices actually do go away. And for other people, they still hear voices, but they're no longer distressing for them. And I would actually call the latter group recovered as well. As long as they're not having, distressing, anomalous experiences that are undermining their well-being and needs, then I'm calling that recovered. Even if they have unusual beliefs, even if they have still hearing voices or other perceptions. So I guess I just want to really put that out. That's an important part of the answer, is what do we mean by recovery? So like, I'll give you my own, I'll just share it. She's fine with this. My own mom, my own mother, she had horrible abuse as a child. And she managed somehow to she stayed out of the psychiatric system completely. Never, as far as I know, she's never been hospitalized, never been on drugs, but she has very unusual beliefs. She believes she's a Venusian goddess. She's a goddess from planet Venus. And she's got a very strong heroic striving. She's here to save, humankind, and et cetera. And but these beliefs are very, you talk to her and think, oh my God, she's mad, or I couldn't know, but they've been solid for my whole life, almost 50 years. And they've hardly changed. And she works, she's completely independent, she meets her needs, she has friends. There's no problem. So I wouldn't actually even call that psychosis. She just has an unusual belief system. So we have to just kind of be careful about how we frame some of this stuff.
So the open dialogue approach has an 85% recovery, right?
That's right, 83 or something, but yeah, in the low 80s, that's right. So first of all, I just want to put that out, because those are really important terminology to kind of just explain what we mean by recovery, what we mean by psychosis, etc. Now, so then when we talk about that, when we talk about people are having extreme anomalous experiences or perceptions or beliefs, which are clearly causing distress and interfering with needs of self or others, now let's call that psychosis. Now, the best methods so far that have been shown is organically in these really poor countries of the world. So indigenous societies, for example, have very, very low rates of even onset of psychosis. And I'm talking about, there's not many left in the world, but I'm talking about the true original indigenous peoples of the world, which aren't many left now, but and then who actually would actually have very high rates of recovery. We're talking, as far as we can estimate, probably 90%. Because they would be seen as having a spiritual experience, and then they would eventually become a shaman, right? And then they would coach other people who had these experiences to become the next shaman. So they had a whole framework for supporting people with extreme experiences that were spiritual in nature. They were able to actually work through the process. It's not that their extreme states necessarily went away, but they were able to hold them in a way that didn't interfere with their needs and actually contributed to the society. Right? We call them shamans or other names. So these are all important points. Now, leaving all that aside for a moment, someone's gone into like a chaotic, florid, psychotic space. There are tense emotions, tense, chaotic belief systems, etc. Then open dialogue approach so far of all the really heavily reviewed methods, I'd say it has probably the most robust outcome of 85% full recovery off all meds. The other 17%, most of them, they're on meds to different extents, but even most of them are still pretty high functioning. Like very few of them end up low functioning. And what they're doing there is family therapy. So the belief structure there is that there's no such thing as one person going into psychosis. They're very systemic in their thinking. And basically the psychotic person is the canary in the coal mine. There's a sensitive person within a dysfunctional system. So if you have a sort of semi-dysfunctional family in some way, and what family isn't a little bit dysfunctional, I suppose, but let's say a particularly dysfunctional family and you have a particularly sensitive person, that person is going to become like the identified patient. They're going to end up becoming overwhelmed, manifesting in these kind of psychosis type experiences. The other family members will typically reinforce that. They kind of create them into this sort of IP, identified patient. And the way out of that is create open dialogue amongst the entire family, where all family members are treated equally, and they're all and they're all encouraged and strongly encouraged to air everything, to put everything out there transparently. And what happens is, as the family heals from its own sort of hidden shadow material, then the person will naturally starts the, the canary in the coal mine will naturally recover as part of that process. So that's open dialogue. And then these homes I told you about, these madness homes where they let people go through the process without drugs or minimal drugs. They have also 80-ish% recovery rates. So there's been iWard, Soteria, Diabasis. These are all different homes that have followed that similar model of it's not unlike the trauma, the mindful somatic trauma approach, where you basically are letting the organic process just happen, but within a container of safety. So then they also have, so we're basically finding this magic number, I'd say, where in the best sort of cases, you're kind of finding 80-85% full recovery rates. And there's always like 15% that never quite seem to pull it off for whatever reason. So who knows, maybe there's something physiological going on there. It's hard to know, but that seems to be the magic number when you have really good support in place.
Wow. So it's really all about support and processing and allowing them to go there and being there with them and creating safety. Inpatient potentially, or intensive outpatient, but a lot of support, a lot of groups.
Yeah, so well, part of it, we talked about how often it goes hand in hand with secure attachment and insecure attachment styles. And so
Right.
often group support and any kind of sort of social support like that can be really helpful, just to help them to move through the interpersonal anxieties. So yeah, family,
Amazing.
group, all of that can be. I know Irv Yalom does a lot of group therapy work, which is pretty neat, and then and really helpful for that kind of thing. One other thing I was just going to say. Oh, sorry, it slipped my mind.
Okay. Well, it's 10:23 our time. I know it's still in the middle of the day by you, and you probably have to get to the beach or the pool or something. And
Clients, actually.
What's that? Clients.
A couple more clients. Still.
Clients in the summer. Okay. For those of you who came on late, Paris Williams is in New Zealand. Oh, Elliot Kaplan, you want to ask a quick? Can we keep it quick?
Oh yeah, actually, I see a question on the side. Has COVID causing? What is it? Has COVID caused symptoms? I honestly have no idea about that. I haven't heard it. I haven't actually looked for it, and I haven't really heard it. So I'm sorry, I don't have any answers to that.
Okay, Dr. Kaplan, go ahead. But quick.
In the 1940s, there was a Dr. John Rosen, MD, who would use paradoxical interventions with psychiatric patients. And he found that it would reduce their anxiety. And I was wondering if you know anything about that, or if you use any paradox.
Yeah. Here's how I frame that. I heard you guys might have seen Richard Schwartz, right? Internal Family Systems. But anyway, I'm a big fan of internal family systems. When you have severe trauma, especially developmental trauma, you end up with, we all have parts, right? But from this perspective, we all have different parts, and they're supposed to work together harmoniously. But if we have severe trauma, they start to create sort of polarizations against each other. So we end up with this intrapsychic stalemate happening. And what'll happen is we can end up with stalemates. One part of me and another part of me are in this constant fight with each other. And it can get really locked up. And so a paradoxical intervention is where you sort of let the feared thing happen, or you do the feared thing, or whatever. There's different ways. Let's say someone has really bad insomnia, for example. You might say, okay, I want you to lay in bed and not sleep for the entire night. Right? That would be a paradoxical intervention. And often they fall, as soon as they try to stay awake, they can't, right? They fall asleep. But what you're often doing with paradoxical interventions is you're kind of breaking the stalemate between these different parts. So with sleep, there's obviously some part of them that's afraid of sleeping in some way. So if you're actually letting that part say, no, okay, I'm gonna let that part be in the driver's seat and say, no, you can't sleep tonight. So that part actually relaxes. Oh, I don't have to worry about sleep. I'm not sleeping. It relaxes, and then they fall asleep. I don't know, it's just one example. So I think with paradoxical interventions, what they were really actually end up getting into is what Richard Schwartz and others came up with later, which is actually these polarized parts, which is totally part of the territory with any kind of severe trauma, dissociation, and psychosis usually. And so I just do it differently. Rather than doing a clever paradox, I would actually invite awareness of the parts. Oh, so it sounds like there's one part of you, that really wants to save the world and, you know, contribute and, you know, really wants to contribute and do great stuff and be important. But then there's this other party that's actually really afraid, like just wants to put your head down and you know, not see anybody. There's like an example. And so let's actually just make space for both parts and get to know them both. And maybe we can actually even have some dialogue between them. I end up doing that kind of work, which I think has some parallels to paradoxical intervention.
Maybe this is similar, but Rosen would actually plan with the client to relapse. And he would specifically tell them, how are you going to relapse? And the more he told the client what the client was going to do to relapse, the more the client was able to relax, and it actually lifted them out.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so it's kind of like that sleep thing a little bit, right? You're like,
Yeah,
okay, and that's actually true. In fact, that's the problem with the medical model. Someone's having a lot of fear and they're having these extreme states. And I say, oh, you have a brain disease called schizophrenia that you're going to have the rest of your life. What's going to happen? I'm going to make their fear get much worse. And I'm going to make their intrapsychic conflict get much worse, because now, oh my God, I got a broken brain. I'm going to be like this forever. And they're going to be even more terrified now. So the way to dispel that, what I did, I give them a little education and, you know, strong, from my opinion, but I think the research very strongly is robust around this. You can totally move through this stuff. This is temporary. You know, people, you know, there's no saying how far you can go. And you know what? It's actually okay to let yourself go a little bit mad. Like, just let it happen. So there's that organic process thing. And paradoxically, when people let go of all that terror and they just kind of let your guard down a bit and let themselves go a little crazy, ironically, they tend to like settle, come out of the threat response, and oh my God, I feel so much more peaceful and I feel more grounded. So yeah,
Okay. Dr. Williams, it's been an absolute honor. This I feel that this perspective, you know, normalizes humans. You know, rather than seeing problems or symptoms or labels or diagnoses, and I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that there are so many mental health professionals who are scared of certain populations. And I think that the psychosis population is one of them because of this reason. And when we start to see them as humans with defense mechanisms versus people who are psychotic and crazy or whatever other terms people might use, it not only enables us mental health professionals to work with them, but also, you know, enables us to feel more comfortable to sit and be with them in their experience, you know, and to see them as more mainstream, you know, their experience is just mainstream clients that we encounter. So I appreciate, you know, you coming on and sharing this with us all the way from New Zealand. I know it's a far trip, and I hope maybe one day you'll join us again in the future. But thanks again for this. And for those of you interested, you can go to Dr. Williams' website, which is rethinkingmadness.com, if I'm not mistaken. Did I get that right? Okay. And again, thanks again for those of you who want to stay on for a minute and say hello. We'd love to meet you. Not that many new people this week, but we'd love to meet you. So thanks again and good night. I'll see you next week.